quickly through this section till we get to where we left off the last time we were together. The first question is, what is a verb? And remember, a verb is a word or group of words that express either an action or a state of being. Example, I could say, Pastor Joel is running. So that's an action, it's something I'm doing. Or I could say Pastor Joel is a pastor, something like that. And that's referring to being a state of being. Or I could say Pastor Joel runs, that's action. Pastor Joel is a pastor, something like that, or is a husband. So we have two different kinds of verbs, the state of being, and then we have actually an action. We talked for a few moments about the way that a verb agrees with its subject. And remember, because the Greek verb has built-in pronouns, it already has a built-in subject. It has to agree with a subject in the sentence, which is in the nominative case. It has to agree in two ways, both in person, that would be first, second, or third person, and in number, that would be singular or plural. So if the verb is a first person singular, we wouldn't say that the word men if it was first person singular, we couldn't say that the word men is the subject, because men is plural, and first person singular, there would be a problem. So we would have to look and see if maybe that's a direct object. Not a direct object, a predicate nominative. So we understand this issue of subject-verb agreement, okay? We also talked about some aspects of the Greek verb. We've already been introduced to person and to number. And so in all of our examples, we've seen this issue of person and number. But there are other aspects to the verb that we had not introduced until the last time we met. Those were tense, voice, and mood. Can someone remember what tense indicates?
Tense indicates the time.
Okay.
That is past, present.
Sure, that's correct. But what we saw in Greek is that tense has more than a time element. Tense actually describes the type of action. Okay, and I'll go back over that in just a minute. What you said is true, but that reflects a little bit more of an English understanding of tense than a Greek understanding of tense. Because when we say present tense, we're not just talking about present action, but we could be talking about an action that is in motion, something that is continuous action, or we could say it's an iterative. It means it happens and happens again and happens again and happens again. Okay, but when we say future tense, that's talking about something that is coming in the future. So that definitely has a time element. And then when we talk about voice, what are the three different kinds of voices? Do you know what I mean by that? Let me start you out with an active voice. What are the other two kinds? And middle, okay? Active, middle, and passive. Active has the idea that the subject is doing the action. Passive has the idea of the subject is being acted on. And middle has the idea of the subject is doing something for itself. It's sort of a blend of the two a little bit, okay? And then what do we mean by mood? Can you give me an example of mood? I don't know that I really mentioned it last week all that well. We can have the indicative mood. We can have something called subjunctive mood. They have something called optative, okay? And we also have a mood of command. And I'll mention that in a little more detail, because that might be something you didn't catch from the last time. But every verb has person, number, tense, voice, and mood. And it's important for us to look at those details, because they do shape the way that we translate certain words, okay? And when we come to our translating section, which we didn't get to last week, you will see what I mean by that. If I'm translating a present tense, I want to shape that verb so that we can see this aspect of action. And I will say this, that's not something that typically is brought out when we're reading an English translation, okay? It's not as common that when you read a present tense that you really get that strong sense of this is iterative or this is something that, is in progress. You don't always get that. And so when you look at it in the Greek text, then you understand that present tense is shaped a little bit, that you may not notice that in a Bible translation. I don't know how Fonte would do that, but I'm guessing you probably wouldn't necessarily see that, okay? For instance, like a perfect tense, you might use the word have. And when you use the word have, okay, it happened in the past, but because it's perfect tense, it also has continuing into the present. And so it's like, how do we communicate that in English? Well, we try to use the word have, but sometimes people don't pick that. They don't quite understand what that word is meaning. It happened then, but there's continuing effects as we sit here today. So we'll try to put that in our translation a little bit, and I'll point that out when we come to it. But you may not pick that up when you're just reading straight in English or Fonte. You might have to look at the Greek to get that. And so if you're teaching, you might not say much about the English, the way that it's written, or the way that the Fonte or the Spanish is written. You may not say much about it, but you may sort of shape that idea as you present it. Are you following what I mean by that? Okay. So we'll come to that in just a minute. We understand person. There's first, second, and third person. What is first person singular? I. Okay. What's first person plural? We. Okay. Second person. You or you. Okay. And then third person is what? They. That's the plural. And what's the singular? There's actually 3 options for the singular. He, she, and it. Okay? Because remember, third person could be talking about a man. It could be talking about a woman. It could be talking about something that is not feminine or not masculine or feminine. Okay? A desk is just a desk. So we would say it. So we do understand person. Number, singular and plural. Okay? So now let's talk just for a few minutes about tense. Tense indicates or shows primarily the type of action which takes place. We would call this the aspect. And to a lesser extent, the time when the action took place. Aspect. There are 3 kinds of aspect. In fact, if you look down in your notes, when we talk about the present tense, the future, the imperfect, aorist, perfect, pluperfect, you notice on the left-hand side column, we have the words imperfective for present, future, and imperfect. And then to the left of aorist, we have undefined. And to the left of perfect and pluperfect, we have perfective. Do you see that? The reason that it's written that way is because imperfective is a way to describe the present, future, and the imperfect tenses. And undefined is the way to describe the aorist tense. And perfective is the way to describe the perfect and the pluperfect tenses. Okay? Now let me explain what I mean by imperfective, undefined, and perfective. Imperfective means that the action of the verb is thought of as ongoing. There is a process. Either it's a continuous action, we would use the term durative because there's a duration, or it's a repeated action. We call this iterative. Start, stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. And so for durative, I have a straight line. Do you see that? because the straight line, there we go. The straight line indicates that it's a smooth action. Like maybe I can hear a humming sound, like okay, it's durative. It's just continuing. It's smooth. It's steady. But if it's dot dot like a drip, then it's iterative. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay. So we could say, like, if a person has a pattern in their life, like the person is walking in righteousness. We don't mean that they're sinlessly perfect, but what we do mean by that is that when you look at the course of their life, you see a steady consistency, okay? Or we could say that maybe a person has developed a dishonest reputation, and so we don't mean that they're always lying, but they lie, and they lie, and they lie. It's iterative. It happens over and over and over again. So imperfective is the aspect that goes with the present tense, the future tense, and the imperfect tense. Okay? So when we talk about those tenses, we have this idea of duration or repeated action. That is the aspect of that tense that we should be thinking of. Do you follow that? Okay? So when I say present tense, don't just think it's happened now to the writer. Think it's been happening. Okay? There's a repeated action, repeated activity. And actually, when you read your Bible, there will be times where the present tense, understanding that we have this durative or iterative aspect, it will really shape your understanding of certain passages. Maybe when Christ confronts the Pharisees and he uses the present tense, he's not just saying, today, right now, you did this, but you have this pattern. Oh, do you understand what I'm saying? It's your way of life. And so it really shapes that quite a bit. The second is called undefined. The action of the verb is thought of as a simple event represented graphically by a dot. We call this punctilinear. So it's just a dot. We're not describing the type of action. We're not saying that this is something that happens a lot or that this is something that happens on a regular basis. We're not saying it happened there and it's continued. We're just looking at the action as a dot. It's a one-time action. That does not mean that it only happened once. But what we're trying to communicate is that we're focusing on that particular event at that particular time. Do you follow what I'm saying? Okay. So, maybe my son's been lying to me a lot. And if I used aorist tense and I said, you have lied to me, you lied, I'm not telling him that he didn't lie in the past. I'm not saying that I'm not telling him that you never developed a reputation or a pattern. I'm just looking at that event. And so that's what I'm focusing on. Do you follow me? And that's what I'm really trying to communicate. So undefined is different than the imperfective, because we're just looking at one time the action versus we're looking at an action that is shaped by time. And this is the aorist tense. Okay? The third is called the perfective. And the perfective deals with both the perfect and the pluperfect tenses. Pluperfect is not very common in the New Testament. There are very few examples of it. So a lot of times in Greek classes, the teachers won't even really address it. For instance, when I took Greek, my teacher said almost nothing about pluperfect, because he said, if you studied the New Testament thoroughly in Greek, you'd find just some small examples. It wouldn't be worth our time to really dig deeply into it, so he didn't go there. But the perfective is the action of the verb is thought of as brought to completion with effects carrying into the present. It's kind of a combination of the imperfective and the undefined. So we have the dot. That is what happened. But there's a continuation of effect. It happened here, but I'm still feeling its effects. For instance, I could say, I have been justified. Okay? Happened in the past. There was a point in time that God declared me righteous. He doesn't declare me righteous every day. He's not saying, I'm justifying you again today, and then tomorrow I justified you again. He's not doing that. He justified me when I placed my faith in Christ. But I am still justified. Do you understand? So that action that took place in the past has still bearing an impact on today, and it will always be that way forever. Okay? When God justified me, it was settled fully. And so that's the idea of the perfective. When we talk about the pluperfect, it's something that happened in the past. There was a duration of time where it had impact, but it has stopped. Do you follow me? So there's a little bit of a difference. It's like there's a dot and a line, but the line has stopped. Whereas the other one is a dot with a line that just continues on to infinity if you want. Okay? At least that's the way we would look at that. So we have this issue of aspect. Now let's talk about tense. The English tense refers to the time, past, present, future. Greek refers to type of action. And the time is indicated specifically by other factors in the syntax, we could say sentence structure, or in the context. And context is very important. One of the things that we learn, and I have this book, it's called Exegetical Fallacies. It's a very interesting book because it discusses a lot how people will make mistakes when they are doing interpretation. One of the things that really caught my attention in that book was the author presents the fact that when we look at a word, we cannot just go to the definition in the dictionary and pick one of them and say the word in this context means this. He said we have to understand that words have what we call a range of meaning. And so this particular word can mean this in this context, and this in this context, and this in this context. So when we read our dictionary, we see a range of meaning for a particular word. And we have to be careful that we examine the context so that when we apply what that word means, we've looked at its correct meaning within the range of meanings. Do you understand what I'm saying by this? I think you could think of examples in Fonte where you have words that can be used in a lot of different contexts. For me, when I was talking to someone trying to teach me the meaning of certain words, I was so confused because I would say, well, I thought this word meant that. And they're like, well, it does here, but not here. I'm like, oh, do you follow me? Now, it is true that words those meanings tend to be very closely related. Okay, we definitely can say that. And the more specific a word is, the narrower its possible meanings are. There's no doubt about that. But we have to keep that in mind. And the same thing is true when we're talking about a particular tense. You see, we might be looking at a specific Greek construction, but that particular construction could potentially have 4 or 5 different meanings. And so when you examine those 4 or 5 possibilities, we could say the range of meaning that has, you can first of all say, it's impossible for this to mean this. Impossible. Because the syntax doesn't allow this meaning. Or you look at the context and you go, these 3 options are impossible based on the context. It's not meaning that. We have 2 options that could be legitimate here. 2 options. Or we have only one legitimate option. We have those kinds of situations. You may even have situations where you go, you know what? There are two legitimate options, both in the context and even within our understanding of the whole Bible, the theology of the Bible. And in those situations, it is possible that an author could use a statement. God could have moved him to write a phrase that has two potential meanings, like a double meaning. I don't know if you're following what I mean by that. Okay, for instance, there are prophecies in the Old Testament that have what we call double fulfillment. There's a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment. And so the people immediately saw a fulfillment. But then, when we read the New Testament, we understand that that prophecy had a much further reaching fulfillment than what just happened in that event. That first fulfillment was to give, could we say, confidence to those people that the far was coming as well. And then we see that. So sometimes prophecies will have a double meaning. In other words, I'm looking and I see this event, but if I look past it, there's a second event that's being fulfilled. And when prophets talk about the day of the Lord, for instance, really, they do this a lot. They talk about something that will happen to Jerusalem today, but they're also talking about what will happen to Jerusalem at the second coming of Christ. They actually have both in mind. And so we see those examples. And I think as you study your Bible, you've probably seen these and you'll see them again. But my point is that when we look at a verb or a word, we need to recognize there's kind of a circle of possible meanings. And there are certain things that they're not within that circle, so we can rule them out entirely, which is where a lot of false teaching comes in. People try to interpret a passage in a way that it cannot be, based on the rules that language has. It cannot be that. And then you have areas where there are possibilities, but if you look at the context carefully, you'll realize there's really only one option, or there's two options and no more. And so, this issue of tense, we have to look at syntax and context to understand what we're talking about there. Any question? Or do you follow what I'm saying there? Okay? Because, language has standards. There's some flexibility within language, but there's a limitation to that flexibility. And I think we understand that. So let's go through the various tenses, and I'll give you a real basic, a real general explanation of those various tenses. The first one is present tense. The aspect is usually continuous and in the indicative mood. Now, we'll talk about mood in a few minutes, but what we mean by indicative is it's indicating that something has happened. Indicative is either a statement or it's a question. Okay? And it's going to be, if it's denoting present time, it will be from the perspective of the writer. And this is, I mentioned this last time, but I remember reading in the Old Testament some passages where, for instance, when the children of Israel crossed over the Jordan River, they put a pile of stones as a memorial in the river. So if someone was going by, they would go, "Why are those stones in the middle of the river? That's very, very strange. How did they get there?" And they would say, "Well, the river was dry when we walked across. And so we put those stones to remember." And the statement is, and it's there to this day. Well, here we are, removed by thousands of years. Is it still there? I don't know. But when that was written, it was there. Okay? And so we can get a little bit confused if we don't think about the perspective of the writer there. The second is future tense. Unlike the other tenses, in which the time element is not primary, the future tense always refers to an event in the future from the point of view of the writer, not the reader. So when Isaiah writes that a virgin will conceive and bear a son, that was future for them, but it's not for us. Okay, it happened, and we see such a powerful testimony to God fulfilling prophecy. But that future tense is now in the past for us. Okay. The imperfect, as the name suggests, the basic idea is of an incomplete action. It's not perfected. It usually is an action in the past from the writer's perspective. And when we talk about imperfect, I believe the idea is I did something for or to myself. Okay? Or, well, that's definitely middle. I'm mixing two things. Sorry, forget what I said. Just look at what I have here. It's usually an action in the past from the writer's perspective. Aorist tense describes undefined action, whether imperfective or perfected, is not considered important. Normally occurs in the past from the writer's perspective. The key, though, is it's an undefined action. Think of it as a dot as opposed to a line. Okay? And the truth is, as we go further into Greek and as you start dealing with some of these issues, then you'll understand a little better what we mean by some of that stuff. At this point, we're just trying to get a real basic. It's kind of like getting a framework, and then we want to build on that framework. Perfect tense describes an action that was brought to completion, whose effects are felt in the present in the time frame of the speaker. So it happened, and I'm still feeling its effects as I write this down right now. Okay? And then the pluperfect describes an action that was completed, whose effects are felt at a time after completion, but before the time of the speaker. So it happened, there's a line, and then it stopped. And now I'm writing about it. So it's in the past tense. Or it is in the past to me. Do you follow what I'm saying? So if we're talking about time, the perfect tense has the idea of past. And pluperfect has the idea of past. The question is, how does that action affect me today? Okay? That's where we actually stopped, I believe, last week. So let's move to the next point of voice. We have three kinds of voice: active, middle, and passive. Active has the idea that the subject is doing the action. Okay? I could say, Pastor Joel teaches Greek. Active. Pastor Joel teaches Greek. If I want to say passive, I could say Pastor Miguel is being taught by Pastor Joel. Now, Pastor Miguel is subject, but he's being taught. The idea is that the action is coming back to him. So it's passive. He's being acted on. Do you follow the difference? One is the subject does it. Passive means it's being done to the subject. And then we have middle voice, which is the subject has a personal interest in the action. For instance, instead of saying I baptize, we could say you baptize yourself. Okay? I decided to baptize myself. So, yes, I'm doing the action, but I'm also receiving the action. It's kind of a blend of the two. Do you follow that? So one is doing action, one is receiving action, and one is doing and receiving because it has a special interest in that. So that's what we mean by voice. And then let me mention this issue of mood. Mood refers to the relationship between verb and reality. Relationship between verb and reality. For instance, indicative. It indicates. It makes a statement or asks a question. So it's focused on a present reality. I could say something like, Pastor Joel asks a question. It's a statement. I could say, do you have any questions? I'm asking a question to you about whether or not you have questions. So a statement or a question indicates a present reality. But there are other ways that we can describe something that is not a present reality. It's something that could happen. It's something we want to happen. It's something we demand happens. And these are different moods. For instance, we have the subjunctive mood. It describes something that may happen. It's in the realm of possibility. It's not a reality, but it could happen. It's probable. Because the action described by a verb in the subjunctive is unfulfilled, it's often referred to as a future event. This is what I would say. I could say something like this. I am going to Accra. Or I could say, I may go to Accra. Do you see the difference? One indicates what's going on. The other indicates what is possible. I may. I might. Do you see how it's different? So when we get a verb that is in the subjunctive, when we translate it, we will translate it by using the term may or might. So we wouldn't say I run, we would say I may run. Do you see the difference? Okay? So we have indicative and then we have subjunctive. Then we have imperative, the mood of command or entreaty. Give us this day our daily bread. We are commanding, or maybe better, we are asking. We're asking God to give us our daily bread. But it's imperative. If I say go to the store, buy this, when I'm giving a command or I'm making a request but it's very strong, then I would say it's imperative. And then the fourth option is called optative. It has the idea of the mood of wish. It's softer than imperative. I'm not telling you to do something. I'm letting you know I would like something to happen. Do you see how it's a lot softer? So I know when people are relating to one another, they use the term please a lot because they're really telling you that you need to do something, but they're softening it to be respectful. And so optative is like the softer version of the imperative. It's more of a desire. In fact, it may not actually be as strong as when you say, please, I would like you to give me that. I think it's a little bit softer than that. So it's almost kind of in between the imperative and the optative a little bit. But we see the distinction. One is a command, one is a desire. And so it's much softer. But do you see the different moods we have? Indicative. This is a present reality. Either I'm telling you something or I'm asking you something. Subjunctive it's something that is possible or probable. It may happen. It might happen. When we have imperative, it's a command. And optative, it's sort of like a wish or a desire. So are you following that? When we look at a verb, it can be present, that's talking about tense. Active, that means that the subject's doing the action. Indicative means it's indicating something or asking a question. Okay? It could be first person, singular. So I would say I. All of that is built into the verb. All of that is built into the verb. And I have these little sheets that have the declensions, the Greek declension. I think at the beginning of the year I gave you one of these. But if you were to look at mine right here, and maybe I'll show it to you after class, we have black letters and we have red letters. The black letters, for instance, on the word luo, indicate what we call the stem. So the verb, without any of its prefixes or suffixes, just the verb without any of that, we have a stem. Lu, it's lambda, upsilon, lu. O, omega, tells us whether it's present, active, indicative, first person, singular. It tells us all of those by that little ending. So we have what we call stems, and we have endings. And then we also have prefixes. And these little pieces, what they do is they tell us what kind of verb it is. Okay? We understand that. If we memorize it all, then we can identify it just looking at it. Like in my computer program that I use, it has something that it's called looking up this. I think it's called searching the lemma. Okay, the lemma. What they mean by that is it's the form that you would find in the lexicon or the dictionary. If you're looking up luo, you wouldn't look up luace or luamen. You would just look up the word luo, which is present, active, indicative, first person, singular. But that's the rough meaning of the word without all these other factors involved. And if we talk about the stem, we're just talking about lambda upsilon. Okay? I wish I put up an example so that you could see it, but after class, I'll show you so that you can sort of visualize what I'm talking about. Now, because we're using interlinear, you don't necessarily have to understand that, or you don't have to know that in rote memory, but understanding that concept does help you when you're looking at it to go, okay, I get what's going on. Okay? Does anyone remember what we call the changes in spelling when we're talking about a verb? Inflection. Very good. So the inflection, how it changes, tells us if it's present, aorist, imperfect, is it pluperfect, is it perfect, is it future, is it active, middle, passive, first person, second, third person, singular, plural. It tells us all of that. Okay? So let's go through a couple of quick practice examples, and then I'll show you this, and we'll kind of come to a close. All right. If you look down on your notes at practice exercises, we have Colossians 1:3 verse Colossians 1:3a. So it's the first part of the verse. Can someone read those three words? Do you want to try that? Eucharistamen to theo. Eucharistamen to theo. Do you see where I am right now? The first example? Okay. So let's isolate the verb for just a minute so we can kind of see the parts there. The V indicates that it's a verb. We have one PPAI. So what do you think that indicates?
First person.
Okay.
Plural, active, indicative.
Yeah, so it's first person, plural, present, active, indicative. Okay? And the way that this does it is it gives you person and number first, and then it gives you tense, mood, and voice. Okay? So that's the way that it does it. So we have first person, present, active, indicative, and then we have two datives. So if it's first person plural, what would be the subject?
First person plural.
First person plural.
The subject would be we.
We, very good. Okay? And then the phrase is give good favor or give thanks. How would we translate that? And before you answer, present tense indicates what kind of an action?
Present and
Yeah.
the
Is it something that is just a dot, or is it more like a line, either dotted line or steady line? What do you think? Huh? A line, okay? So, notice how this is translated. We always give thanks to God. We always give thanks to God. Now, you don't have to do it always. You could say something like this. We continually give thanks to God. But do you understand how in that translation you're trying to shape it as giving the idea of a continuous action? For instance, think about it in its context. This verse is Paul writing to the church of Colossae, and he's saying, we have a practice of giving thanks to God for you. The idea is that I didn't just do it once. I constantly think about you, and I pray for you constantly. Do you understand what I'm saying there? So that's why the way that this was translated by the book that I'm using for the notes, he gives the idea we always, or we continually. In fact, I'm trying to think how it's worded. I think the word continually may even be used. I can't remember off the top of my head. But the idea is that there's a constant action. Not just a one-time thing, but it's something that's going on regularly. And then we have to God because it's in the dative. But let me show it to you on here. We is the subject. Give thanks, or always give thanks, verb. And then we have the line pointing to, indicating the dative, to God. Okay? And by the way, it's understood that we're always giving thanks for you to God. That's why we have it written the way that it is. But are you following that? Any question? Okay, but what I'm trying to say is when you translate the present, you may want to try to translate it in a way that gives the sense of a continuous action. I'm not saying that it's absolutely incorrect for you to do that without it. But what I would say is that you miss something if you don't translate it that way. Or if you don't at least explain it that way. Let's look at a second example, Matthew 5:13. Humes este ta halas tes ges. Where's the verb here? What word? What? No, the verb. The verb. Do you see the verb?
The verb is
Look at the second word in our example. Okay. I was looking for the Greek word.
the Greek word.
Sorry, you are correct, the English, but it's este, r. Okay, so let's look at it. It has 2p, p-a-i. So what is that? Can someone tell me?
Second person, present.
Well, you missed one. Second person, singular or plural? Which one?
Second person, plural.
Plural. Very good. And then it's
Active indicator.
okay. Very good. Very, very good. All right. And then what is the subject?
The subject is secondary this week, you.
You. Okay. Now let's think about it. Before I ask you about direct object, this word este is a form of a me, And emi is a being verb. So is this going to be looking, are we going to be looking for a predicate nominative or a direct object? What do you think?
You said it's a being verb.
Yes.
So we predicate nominative.
Very good. We're going to look for a predicate nominative. And so we see two nominatives. So which nominative is the subject and which one is the predicate nominative?
You is as a nominative.
Uh-huh.
I think that is the subject. And then salt
Is what?
the predicate nominative.
Very good. Very good. Okay. And by the way, technically, when we're talking about a predicate nominative, these two words could be used interchangeably. You are salt and salt you are. Okay? So they're interchangeable, they're equal, but you is the subject. Okay? It's coming first in the sentence. Now what is a little tricky is salt does have an article. So that's a little tricky, but I do think that you would be the subject here. Okay? And then of the land, this is a genitive, so that's why we use the word of. But what is that functioning as? Of the land is doing what? It's a genitive, so it's what's it doing? It's modifying a word. Which one? Okay, good. Which salt? The salt of the earth. Okay. So this is how we could translate it. You are the salt of the earth, or you are continually the salt of the earth. Notice the way it's translated, he wants to give the idea of a continual state of being, not just you were, you will be, but you are continually. But you can get that sense. And then here's what it would look like on the diagram. You, subject, are, continually, the verb, salt, predicate nominative, of the land or of the earth, is modifying salt. Okay, do you see that? And then we have a third example, Mark 7:9. Can someone try to read that one? Very good. That sounds very interesting, huh? Okay, very good. And let's isolate our verb. What's our verb? The first word. How would you say that in Greek? Athetete. Athetete. Oh, that's a mouthful. And by the way, let me say something here. If you can learn to read Greek out loud, and you read your New Testament in Greek out loud, you will discover that there are times that they use figures of state that when you're reading, you'll hear certain how could I put it? You'll hear words that are repeated a lot. You'll hear words that are similar, where they're actually playing off of each other. These are things that you don't necessarily see in translation. But if you're reading it out loud, you might notice how that word and that word sound almost exactly alike. They're different words, and they were chosen that way to draw attention, to get our attention. You'll see those kinds of things. So there are figures of speech, you might say, that are used in the Greek New Testament that you miss out. For instance, let's say that you were to translate an English poem that had rhyming in it into Spanish. You won't get it. You'll totally miss it. Or the other way. It's like if someone's just speaking straight and they're not using that kind of description, then you get it, but you miss that when you translate. In fact, even when we're studying, for instance, the Psalms, we really don't get a sense of the poetry that's there, but there's poetry. It's really, really interesting. And so if you could look at it, even if you couldn't read it, if you looked at it in Hebrew, you would go, hey, there's a structure there that I've never seen before. It's very interesting. Like, for instance, Psalm 119. You'll see that each section is started with like Aleph, Beta, Gemma, okay, Daleth, Epsilon. Okay, it has a little Hebrew word. Why is that? It's because that section is started by that letter. Okay, and it's part of the poetry, and so we miss that. I mean, the message that is presented it's still God's word. We haven't missed that. But what we do miss is some of the unique elements that come to us through the language itself. And so sometimes you'll hear repetition of sounds, or sometimes you'll hear words that are playing off of each other. And so Paul might use those kinds of things, or a biblical penman may use those kinds of things, because he's drawing attention. And we also have to realize that the New Testament was primarily heard, not read, by people living at that time. They didn't all have a copy of the Scriptures like we do. So the public reading of Scripture was something that was a very, very important part of their worship. And so they would gather together and they were hearing it read. And so some of those elements would really catch people's attention, whereas we completely miss those things. So it's interesting. I mean, I know that sounded funny. Athteteten ten entelen. It almost is kind of rhyming. Okay? Do you see that?
Yeah.
So
this phrase, you set aside, it's all put in one way.
Yes.
In the Greek.
In the Greek, it is. It's one word. But these are some of the interesting things that you will pick up if you can read it in the original, and it's kind of neat.
Really, the way Psalm 119 is broke down into sections. Each section starting with that Hebrew writing. I thought it was very interesting. I thought if I understood Hebrew, I think there would be a lot of unique things that you'll be able to notice about.
Yeah, it's true, and I'll say this too. Especially a person who's an unbeliever, we as believers don't appreciate some of these things, but like someone who's never been exposed to the Bible, if they listen to someone teach and they understand some of those elements, they start realizing this is an amazing book. You understand? I mean, for an unbeliever, just thinks of it as a rule book. Here's like 500 things you can't do in life, and here's 200 things you're supposed to do. But the Bible is written, and in some places as poetry. You have the other couple weeks ago, I was going through one of the Psalms on Tuesday night, and I brought out the fact that this is a great example of communion with God, where David's reflecting on a truth about God, and then he prays, and then he stops and he reflects again on, and then he prays again, and then he purposes based on something that he's thinking about, and he reflects on something in the past, and you see this flow of ideas going on with David, and God wanted that preserved for us so that we could understand this is how we commune with God. It's reflecting on Him, it's praying, it's purposing in light of that, and those are things that we sometimes really miss out on. And you see these kinds of things a lot quicker if you're looking at it in the original language, because it captures it better.
But as common students of the Bible, we resist all these things.
Sure, it was true. It's true, but this is one of the values of studying some of these things. You know, and the more you study it, the more you appreciate some of these things. But let me just give you quickly the rough translation, and then we'll look at the diagram. It's you all continually set aside the commandments or the command of God. Notice the idea as you didn't just set it aside once, but this is something you are continuously doing. And in the context, Christ is speaking to the Jews. I believe he's speaking specifically to the religious leaders. And he's saying, you have a continual way of life, a practice of disregarding the commandments of God. So it's very, very descriptive. I think we get a little bit more understanding when we look at that. And then here's the diagram. You, subject, set aside the verb. Command, direct object of God, is the genitive, and it is modifying command. And then we'll just quickly show you the last one here. Tein, agapein, tu theou uk akete. You all continually have not the love of God. You all continually have not the love of God. And you can see we have not. It's indicating, making negative have. We have love of God. We see how God is modifying love. And then we can see subject, verb, direct object. So we kind of see all of that there. Okay, any question or comment? That's our last slide that I wanted to mention. As you can see, the Greek verb is actually each one of these parts. There are rich things that we can glean from these. And one of the things that I've learned as I study the Bible is that the more carefully I look at it, the more time I think to analyze the context and maybe to even think about some of these unique elements, the more it hits me. It's like our understanding of the truth is sort of like looking at the surface. And if we read things quickly, we do get a very surface understanding. But as we look at it more slowly, it goes a little deeper. And the more we go below the surface and our understanding of that truth, the more it really goes deeply into us. You understand? It really moves our hearts. And there are times where if we look at that concept and we understand it within the language that was given, and some of the things that we quickly look past, if we look at it more deeply, I think it really more permanently resonates in our heart, and it really moves us a little bit more. And I think that's part of the value of these things. It's like if I'm studying God's Word to present it, and it hasn't moved me deeply, then it's really going to affect the way I present it. I was talking to someone the other day. It was Enoch, actually. I was talking to him about his teaching. And I mentioned to him, I said, I noticed when you were teaching on some of these truths that the way you presented it, it came different than some past lessons. And the reason is I can tell it really sunk into your heart. And it really affected you. It's like you didn't just sterilely put together a lesson and give it. Oh, here's a lecture. But it actually really sunk down into your heart, and you started thinking about specific issues, and God was really working in you. And so as you presented it, it gave you a greater sense of urgency. And I could really sense that. And God really used that. And I was presenting that to him. And the point of me saying that is, as we look at things in the original language, sometimes we get a deeper sense of that than we do reading it in English or Fanti, because we get a deeper sense of what he's actually saying. It's like we can look at a verse without a context and it has value, but when we look at that in light of context, all of a sudden it hits us much harder, because we realize, if God would say it to them, then what would he say to me? You follow me? Okay. So there's a lot of neat things that we can glean here.